I'm old enough to remember when the term compassionate conservative was thrown around, and the term compassion generally was something that was talked about in politics. It certainly seemed to be absent in the 2016 election, but what's really going on under the surface when it comes to the different parties and compassion in politics? Joining us now to help break down some of her research is American politics lecturer at the University of Pittsburgh, Mary Long. Mary, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Very glad to have you here. So you did a write-up recently of some of the research that you were conducting back during the 2016 Republican primary, right about when it closed, having to do with compassion in the different political parties. And you found something very interesting about Donald Trump that we're going to turn to in just a minute. But before we get to that, in general, looking back over multiple elections, Democrats and Republicans, are there big differences in how much compassion they tend to experience for their fellow American?
So no, and that was the interesting thing that I found. So what I did was I had a survey. I actually looked at survey questions across several different waves of surveys, starting in 2002, 2004, 2008, and 2012. And they have these questions on there that basically ask people how they view themselves. And one of the questions was, how much you agree with the statement, I have concern for others in need. Or another question was, people should worry about themselves and not worry about others so much. And people ranked themselves how much they agreed with that or disagreed with that. And there was actually a wide variety of responses. So it wasn't like you might think, where everybody said that they were super compassionate on those types of questions. Instead, there was a variety, and what I found was that on average, Republicans and Democrats were the same, and this was a little bit surprising to me, but not really, because when you think about those questions, those are about how you see yourself and potentially how you interact with other people. And from my own life, knowing lots of friends and family who are Democrats or Republicans, I haven't noticed a difference in sort of personal interactions with people or kind of general compassion. We can get into politics in a moment, but I wasn't that surprised by that. But it was a big contrast to some of these other measures, things like racial attitudes, things like measures of authoritarianism, so authoritarian personality. So all these things that sort of increasingly divide Republicans and Democrats in the public, you don't find that when you ask about how compassionate people are in terms of their, just how they see themselves personally. So,
well, that is certainly interesting because we hear liberals described as bleeding hearts, but we also know that Republicans tend to identify more strongly as Christians, people who are inspired to see their fellow man in a different way based on their religion. So it's interesting that in general, you don't find huge differences. But when it comes to Trump supporters, you did find something. And I would imagine that since their slogan is "Make America Great Again," it's about improving things, there must be a lot of compassion, right?
Well, I initially wrote this article for the conversation, and the headline was, "Who's more compassionate, Democrats or Republicans?" And I liked that headline that the editor chose. And then it got picked up by Raw Story, which is fine. The way the conversation works is different publications can pick it up. And they rewrote it, and they wrote, "Trump supporters significantly lack compassion." And I really just found only a hint of that. That would be something that you would have to study in much more detail. This was one study that I did, and it was a survey of about 1,000 people, and it was during the primaries. And essentially, there was a difference between people who supported Trump at the time and people who were Republicans but didn't support Trump. And so the Republicans who didn't support Trump had responded to those compassion questions the same as the Democrats, but the Republicans who did support Trump in the primary at that time on this one survey did score significantly lower. So, like a lot of social science work, this would need to be replicated, and we would need to really dig into this and see, how were they interpreting the questions? What did it mean to them? But I did find it interesting, and part of why I found it so interesting was because a lot of my research is looking at how do elites, so political leaders' messages, potentially influence these types of responses and these types of behaviors in their constituents. And so, as we know, Donald Trump didn't use much compassionate language in his campaign. And he actually used far less compassionate language than many other presidential candidates, including Republican candidates. So usually when you're running a big national campaign, you are kind of trying to sound caring and compassionate. And he really didn't. With a few exceptions, that was not part of his repertoire of things that he was trying to appeal to. So my initial reaction was, is some of this actually a factor of people answering these questions who are supporting Trump, who are kind of responding to his rhetoric as well? So.
And so I assume that were there to be some sort of follow-up to this, an analysis of his speeches would probably be a part of it. And looking into, to whatever extent that you can, did he just happen to attract these sorts of people, or was there any sort of adaptation over the course of a campaign? Did he do anything to sort of get these people on his side?
Exactly, yeah.
And one thing that I think also complicates this is, so at the time that you were doing this analysis, Trump supporter means people who choose Trump over other Republicans, whereas now Trump supporter means a lot of Republicans, even people who didn't choose him over Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz or anything like that. I did have one other question though, and that is, there was another wrinkle, and it was that regardless of how much compassion people personally feel in their life, there does seem to be a bit of a difference between Republicans and Democrats in the connection between that personal sense of compassion and their political activity. Is that something that you see continuing going forward?
Yeah. So that was a pretty regular occurrence. So what you could do is you could take how compassionate somebody said they were and use that to predict their views on a bunch of different things. But that really only worked for Democrats and for liberals. So for Democrats and for liberals, the more compassionate they were, the more opposed to the death penalty, the more in favor they were of providing government services to the poor, of providing health care, things like that. And then for Republicans, you didn't see that connection. You did see it with things like volunteering and charity, so things in the private sector. So the more compassionate they were, the more likely they were to volunteer, give to charity, things like that. And the only political issue you saw it for Republicans was actually abortion, where among Republicans, the more compassionate they were, the more likely to say that they were against abortion, more pro-life. And that might make sense because that is an area where you've seen political rhetoric obviously being used on behalf of, I didn't mention immigration. That's a big issue. So you could see Democrats using more compassionate language on behalf of immigrants and people who need government services and things like that. And potentially an issue where Republican elites might use compassion would be for the unborn. Interesting.
Well, Mary Long, we really appreciate you joining the show today. Fascinating research, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for watching this clip from The Damage Report. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and ring the bell on YouTube to get notifications of our new videos. And of course, you can catch the full Damage Report live every weekday at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific on TYT Network on YouTube TV.